Hello, everybody. Welcome to Offscreen, our second or fourth, depending on how many you've been to today, panel. Yes, Nathan.
There's a lot of extra people. Would anybody like us to switch the overflow room to room B? Would anybody go over to room A? Raise your hand if you would go over to the overflow. Anyone? There's a few. All right, that's more than there's for room A. So head over to room C if you'd like, and we're going to live stream this next door.
Basically, you'll have a seat. And then you can come back for questions if you want. Then we'll just get started because it's still 3:30. Okay, so welcome to Offscreen. Thank you for being at Theorizing the Web. Few housekeeping things. Bathrooms are right over there. We have an anti-harassment policy. You can read that abridged version in the actual pamphlet. The full version is online. What else? Yes, we will have our panelists present, and then we'll have a short little discussion and open it up to audience questions. So this panel is on Digitality, which is a word I recently learned and don't fully still understand what it means, but basically like everything that happens on the web kind of. Basically that concept is not constrained to our screens, right? Like it's not just happening online. It shapes the structures of our society. It shapes our buildings. It shapes the ways that we move around in space. It shapes the way that we interact with people. And so this panel is really going to be on how it shapes, our relationships, how it shapes what we perceive to be real in the society, and specifically how it organizes the places in which we work and live. So first up is Nina Medvedeva. Nina's a PhD student in feminist studies at the University of Minnesota. Her work focuses on how city residents politically mobilize to navigate Airbnb specifically, Airbnb's particular monetization of the home and displacement. So welcome, Nina. Please, yes, applause. And then, does this work? Yes. You can take a seat or stand, Mike.
I'll just stand. Does anybody need access copies? Because I have copies of the paper. And if you're live streaming this, just feel free to follow along. This is going to be up there for a little while, so feel free to follow the bit.ly. So I met Paul at a coffee shop near San Francisco's Panhandle on an overcast summer day. Paul was a member of a large coalition that formed in response to, quote, a housing crisis exacerbated by Airbnb. Members of the coalition described it as a gathering of, quote, odd fellows who oftentimes didn't see eye to eye but were still working together. The coalition started in San Francisco proper and was later taken up by similar groups in New York City and Washington, D.C. Landlord associations and tenants' rights groups, hotel unions and hotel owners, groups otherwise hostile to one another came together in order to pass what they saw as fair regulation for short-term rentals. And for folks who might not know what short-term rentals are, it's kind of like the practice of renting your room or an entire unit to someone short-term via an online platform. When I asked Paul about his home-sharing activism, he looked at me suspiciously and asked me why I didn't use the term short-term rental. When I told him I've mostly been talking to Airbnb hosts, he relaxed and explained his apprehension. Quote, I haven't heard this term for a long time, except from the home sharers. It's so warm and fuzzy. Tech was very media savvy. Their whole notion was to hide this large commercial enterprise by people renting 25 units and then selling this operation as mom and pop talking to lovely Swedish tourists around the family dining table. Wow, should have had this two-sided. Even our side would refer to it as home sharing. How do you run a campaign against someone sharing their home? So we knew we were in a political fight. We had to make Airbnb sound like an STD. Paul's statement shows how the idea of home is central to the political fight around short-term rental regulation. He deconstructs home sharing in order to argue that Airbnb leaned on domestic imagery to disguise a broader phenomenon of displacement happening in San Francisco and other major US cities. However, this deconstruction is controversial. Airbnb hosts insist that Paul's critique misrepresented the true nature of short-term rentals, and that the coalition's regulations would unduly punish hosts simply trying to earn extra income. In this paper, I want to follow Paul's provocation and think about what centering home can do for theorizations of the platform economy and platform futures. By tracing the short-term rental debate in San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York City, I present how platforms like Airbnb are sites through which platform capitalism is contested in the present and where strategies for its contestation can be developed in the future. So for folks who might not be familiar with what platform capitalism is, it's Nick Chernyshev's idea that the economy is increasingly moving towards a business model organized around platforms. Chernyshek defines the platform as a new type of firm that designs and governs an interface on which users interact with one another. The function of a platform is to extract data from its users' activities and then monetize the data to draw in advertising revenue, give advantages to algorithms, and transform lower-margin goods to high-margin services. Advertising platforms like Alphabet's Google and cloud computing platforms like Amazon's web service are just a few examples of the platforms that fall under the rubric of platform economy. In Chernyshev's theorization, Airbnb is a kind of lean platform that retains control over its digital infrastructure, but outsources the cost of maintenance, training, and labor to its users. It creates a pool of precarious freelance workers who have to maintain their own homes and the services they provide while paying Airbnb a fee for their listings. The Chernyshek doesn't specify what data Airbnb collects or how it's used. It's easy to imagine Airbnb pressing out hotels and keeping costs low by just suggesting rates. Chernyshek gives these kind of platforms short shrift because he thinks that, unlike other platforms, lean platforms seem doomed to fail because they can only extract so much, and the venture capital funding that's funding them will eventually dry up. So I think Chernyshek missteps here because he fails to consider the different user bases on lean platforms. Uber drivers and other platform contractors are individual workers operating in an economy that seeks to drive down their wages. Meanwhile, users who post short-term rentals on Airbnb do not necessarily share the same burden. In my research, I found that short-term renter hosts range from large-scale landlords who rent out entire buildings to homeowners with an extra property or part of their home that sits unused for most of the year. So the users do certainly take on reproductive labor of hosting. So they clean, they greet their guests, they book rentals, but they either outsource these tasks to hospitality providers or they kind of see it as a limited investment that gets them a lot of money. So I'm going to talk about gentrification now. While Airbnb's platform still largely depends on taking a cut from its users, the source of funding is guaranteed through the creation of a rent cap. The rent cap is created by comparing the rent that can be extracted from renting a unit to a long-term tenant based in the city, and the rent that comes from short-term rentals to business and pleasure travelers. Landlords, homeowners, and even renters can take advantage of this rent cap by embracing a flow of short-term travelers over long-term tenants. In turn, Airbnb becomes profitable because it can monetize on the rapid pace of rentals and listings in an area. So there's gentrification. There's growing evidence that Airbnb is abetting, if not fomenting, a gentrification crisis in major cities in the United States and globally. Studies by grassroots activists collaborating with spatial geographers have shown that Airbnb is partially responsible for rising rates and evictions of low-income tenants. All these grassroots signs point to the role of the rent cap and the negotiation of what counts as home in Airbnb's profitability. These concerns were debated in City Council, where affected residents, industry representatives, activist leaders, and independent experts provided testimony in favor or against regulations. Residents also wrote op-eds, held rallies, visited legislators, collected petition signatures, funded political ads, and employed other grassroots strategies to move their vision of the home forward. Although this legislation was different in each city, the debate generally contested around 4 points. So the first is platform accountability. Great. So in the Google slide, there was like this really cool, like well-formatted header for each of these. So imagine this one says platform accountability. This one says primary residence. This one says tenant safety. And this one says liability. Great. Thanks, Microsoft. The question at the heart of platform accountability was whether Airbnb should be held liable for what people did with their home on its online platform. Prior to the passage of regulations like San Francisco's Airbnb ordinance, short-term rental platforms were not held liable if their users posted an illegal listing. Following a legal victory by San Francisco and U.S. District Court, platforms became liable for users whose listing did not comply with local law or with the agreements of local institutions like building rules and homeowners association guidelines. primary residence, so should Airbnb hosts be allowed to rent more than one residence? With the lack of platform accountability, the rent gap on Airbnb created incentives for bad actors to take advantage of the system. In the Bay Area, activists describe how landlords used the LSAC to evict residents from housing that they had lived in for generations, and then converted that housing into Airbnb units. Likewise, activists in New York and DC profiled how rent-controlled buildings were emptied and turned into full-time hotels for services like Airbnb and VRBO. This tension created a common talking point of Airbnb acting as a hotel rather than as a home. Airbnb provided the same service as a hotel, all the while not being constrained by the same protective measures as hotels and long-term residences. The Airbnb home flouted the divide between hotel and house, and this in turn came at the cost of being able to live in one's home for many residents. Tenant safety. So how are Airbnb guests screened and tenant safety maintained? A landlord association representative told me that the constant rotation of guests created a safety and community issue in apartment buildings. Quote, people who are long-term residents have an incentive to keep the peace, treat their neighbors nicely, and not party until 4 in the morning. A kid was pushed in an apartment lobby by an Airbnb guest. There's no vetting process, end quote. In his view, Airbnb disrupted tenants' sense of being at home in one's community by introducing complete strangers who did not care about the other tenants' well-being. To Airbnb users, the apartment was less of a home and more of a pit stop. So the final one, liability. Who is liable for Airbnb hosts' short-term rental business? Hotel owners and landlords associations were quick to point out that Airbnb was essentially running a hotel without having to face the same liability. In city council hearings, hotel owners argued that Airbnb listings did not have to comply with disability accommodations, government inspections, or obtain the same level of insurance as hotels. And landlords, for the sake of time, I'm going to cut this one, but basically landlords were like, well, we only have home insurance, and if people have run businesses out of our apartment buildings, then we have to pay a higher insurance premium, and we can't really afford to keep this building. So this analysis did not go uncontested by Airbnb and its supporters. Airbnb hosts were quick to point out that the coalition relied on data reported by third-party sources. Furthermore, hosts stated that while they were sympathetic to taking action against illegal actors, they believed that the regulations would place an onerous responsibility on homeowners to meet the same standards as businesses. So, for example, an Airbnb host in New York told me she had to pass a safety inspection, file the right paperwork, and pay hundreds of dollars in fines if she failed. Likewise, tourists operating outside of tourist hotspots, such as hosts in Southeast DC, talked about how Airbnb was a lifeline in gentrifying neighborhoods. So what cuts across all these debates is the importance of what a home is and who a home is for. Residents, legislators, and affected parties debated about what the shift that Airbnb was bringing to the space of residential home was. They were debating whether the shift that was being brought to the home was acceptable for city residents. So I contend that the center of these debates is the governance of the home, the commercial activities allowed inside it, who should occupy residential spaces, and how these spaces should be regulated under the law. In focusing on the governance of home, I want to push theories of platform capitalism to focus beyond capital and data, and instead think through how other social formations delimit platform possibilities. So, in case folks are curious, ultimately the coalition succeeded in passing regulations in all the 3 cities I've discussed, although New York is still in court over them, and DC's mayor is like, it's unconstitutional, I'm not signing these regulations. So when thinking through what these victories mean for contesting platform capitalism, I'd like to return to Paul in San Francisco. I asked Paul about the political lessons he learned when fighting for short-term rental regulations. He said, quote, "There's no reason to be afraid of these guys. They spend a ton of money, millions of dollars, but it doesn't do them any good. And as other cities adopt the San Francisco model, the commercial operators get washed out. If they lose that, suddenly they're not worth $31 billion anymore, and if they go public for anything less than that, that's not good for them." In other words, the governance of home and city council, not a lack of investment capital, landed the biggest blow against Airbnb. I don't really have time to go into this in full detail. I want to end by gesturing to what the fight against short-term rentals might tell us about contesting platform capitalism more broadly. The coalition I described above is far from a utopian proletarian uprising or really the decolonial kind of shift that we need. It is residents working hand in hand with industries against a competing industry that seeks to restructure how a city operates. In addition to losing business, hotels, landlords, tenants, and workers wanted to keep cities affordable so that workers could continue to live close to where they worked. Though it is immediately lacking in any major revolutionary potential, I believe that this grassroots approach shows how the conditions of the economy are always contested. Platform capitalism's development and entrenchment are far from inevitable and can be blocked at various scales. As theorists, I want to encourage us to think critically about these possibilities. Activism is not the universal force that ought to replace capital on account of economies, but one cannot be thought without the other. Thanks.
So next up we have Keli. Keli is an independent scholar and community activist who lives and works in the outskirts of Silicon Valley in Santa Cruz, California. She's received a master's in media, culture, and communication from NYU and is currently faking it until she makes it before officially rejoining her comrades in academia.
This is a better mic.
I'm not sure where they are. Really, where did I find this? No, I think it's still on here. Oh, sorry. KLG. All right, let's give this a go. Okay. How do I even? What? Okay. Hi, I'm Keli. So before we begin, I just want to get a show of hands. How many people here grew up in a suburban neighborhood with an alarm system in your home? Cool. Yeah, so the first electronic alarm system was actually invented in 1851 by a guy named August Russell Pope. And that was patented in 1853 before he died of typhoid. That's him on the left. Before he died of typhoid in 1858, he actually sold his patents to this guy, Edwin Holmes, and he sold it for close to $10,000, which was a lot of money back then. Edwin Holmes actually moved his business to New York City, where all the burglars of the world make their homes, and he aggressively marketed this to New York City elite and published like testimonials of people who had the electronic system in their home, because there was kind of a skepticism surrounding electricity during that time. So it was aggressively marketed through testimonials and so on. In the 1970s, motion sensors were introduced to alarm systems, and then in the 80s, infrared technology was implemented to make this more effective, and then by the 90s, we really see this kind of like happening everywhere, and this kind of, took place alongside the like McMansion phenomena like the 80s and 90s. So then if we fast forward to the 2000 teens, Jamie Siminoff invents Doorbot, and this is him on Shark Tank. He actually didn't get any funding on Shark Tank, but later on he rebranded his smart doorbell as Ring. And the idea is that, he was actually frustrated when he was working in his garage one day and a package was delivered, and he was mad that he couldn't actually just see on his phone who was at his front door. So this is how this came about. So Ring is just, oh wow, that's like super washed out. Ring is just one product in a crop of new smart home surveillance devices that detect motion, trigger video recordings, and then alert the owner of activity directly to their phone. This is not uncommon for lots of the kinds of home security surveillance devices that we see today. But what's unique about Ring is the accompanying app Neighbors. So this is actually like some screenshots from my phone off just like what you see when you're looking at Neighbors. So it basically functions like a social media style app. So there's like content, pictures, videos, and actually people post their Ring footage onto Neighbors. So you actually can't post onto Neighbors if you are not using Ring. So unlike Facebook or Instagram, where you'll see pictures of babies and memes and outfits and so on, it's a crime feed. So the idea is that it's set to your address and it's a radius surrounding your home, and you can go onto Neighbors and you can see, all of the criminal suspicious activity that's taking place. So this is neighbors online on the website, and I think this really tells us pretty much everything we need to know. It's the new neighborhood watch that brings your community together to help create safer neighborhoods. So with real-time crime and safety alerts, law enforcement and the Ring team, Neighbors proactively keeps you in the know. So I think this idea of staying in the know is really interesting, and I situate Ring and Neighbors kind of in a culture of fear and a general kind of anxiety surrounding uncertainty and risk and how we can protect against these things. So I'm not going to try to define fear, because this is obviously a very, very robust concept, to say the least. But I actually lifted this definition from Google because it was just the easiest thing. Seriously. Culture of fear is a term that refers to perceived prevalence of fear and anxiety in public discourse and relationships, and how this may affect the way people interact with each other as individuals and as democratic agents. So fear is also kind of known as a cultural metaphor that expresses claims, concerns, values, moral outrage, and condemnation in our culture. And it's mediated through moral norms. And so discourses of fear are dialectical insofar as they situate individual strategies of management against collective dimensions of harm. So oftentimes there's kind of like, as much as there's fear-mongering in our culture and in our media, there's kind of like a private nature of fear. It really operates on an individual level, and it's kind of your responsibility to manage your exposure to that fear or the threats that might come at you. But I also want to mention that I think the distinction between fear and anxiety is that anxiety kind of is like an existential threat to an individual, and fear is the crux of that distinction, I think, is that there's like an event or something that takes place that kind of translates an underlying insecurity of anxiety into like a tangible fear, something that we actually need to be afraid of. So like if you live in a haunted house, you might be like kind of scared that you live in a haunted house, but until you actually see a ghost, it's maybe not necessarily fear. But that's also going to determine how you mediate or how you interpret what's going on in your home, right? Knowing that you live in a haunted house, like the door opens because of the wind and suddenly you're, convinced that it's a ghost or anything like that. So I digress a little bit. In the context of Ring, where the aim is basically to securitize your home against burglars, a strategy to ease your anxiety about that potential unknown, that known unknown, that at some point in time, your home could be burglarized. And this is obviously a big concern if you live in suburbia, where you feel a little bit like off the beaten path from the activities of urban life and so on. So Neighbors, on the other hand, demonstrates how that underlying insecurity is translated into a fear. So that potential of, your home being broken into, look, it actually happened 3 miles away from you on this app. And so that's, of course, not taking into account the kind of built environment between you and that 3 miles, highways, roads, and then also the environments like rivers and woods and forests and mountains and so on. So it's kind of like translating that underlying insecurity into tangible fear. And ultimately, what security is all about is creating those conditions of protection against the unknown. And there's that keeps you in the know bit, right? So stay ahead of local crime. Criminals target neighborhood, not individual homes. So this is like kind of really drawing on this is really calling us to find solidarity within our neighborhoods. Okay, so anyway, I want to move on into talking about the history of Neighborhood Watch. So in the late 1960s and 70s, high rates of unemployment, poor access to healthcare and education, high crime rates signaled that the current system of Keynesian economics big government was really going to be unsuccessful in alleviating these social problems. So the civil rights movement, anti-war movement, back to the land movement, free universities, second wave feminism, women's liberation. We see increased divorce rates. And also there's the Cold War. So there's a very intense kind of suspicion surrounding security and actually surveilling individuals. So it was kind of proposed as an idea in the late 60s to mobilize private resources to kind of work with police to make mitigating or to controlling crime as like an individual and like a community responsibility. So it was about like responsibilizing a community. So in 1972, Neighborhood Watch became an official entity of the National Sheriff's Association. So it taught and trained local groups, how to be eyes and ears for local law enforcement, not to act, but to contact law enforcement when they see or hear something. So, of course, I think everybody recognizes this guy, Boris the burglar. And I just think it's kind of interesting because if we know that fear is a cultural metaphor to interpret things about, cultural metaphor, we can basically say, oh, okay, Boris the burglar, like that's quite interesting. This is the Cold War and we're all terrified of the Russian threat. So maybe that's assumptive to assume that Boris is Russian, but that's okay. So it operates on a idea of police community co-production, which promises an enriched provision of security. But as we all know, there is a dark side to that. One of the most notable examples would be the death of Trayvon Martin, being murdered by George Zimmerman. And George Zimmerman, of course, was a paid community security guard, and he deemed him to be suspicious. And so, as we know, Zimmerman was found not guilty. So that's kind of resting on this articulation of rights and how, security and protection to communities is not only like your right, but it is actually your civic responsibility. And so kind of negotiating citizenship or belonging into a community by exercising your right to protect yourself and that community. So I want to, I guess, just move on, finish talking about surveillance capitalism. So something that's also very interesting about Ring and Neighbors is that Amazon actually bought Ring in 2008 for over $1 billion. It was Amazon's second largest acquisition after Whole Foods. So it's pretty interesting. And yes, Amazon is, of course, wanting to compete with Google's slew of home devices and kind of like rounding out this smart home portfolio of products. But also, Amazon does the dirty work of ICE and other military organizations. And so if we're kind of reading between the lines here, what we know is that big tech's primary concern is to collect data and to sell us more things. And so Shoshana Zuboff, a Harvard professor, recently published this book earlier this year, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, and she really chronicles kind of like in the post-9/11 world all of the ways that these big tech companies kind of capitalized on these notions of insecurity and fear. So I guess I want to talk about, would like to finish, I guess, yes, I would like to finish by talking about how platforms are going to always be protected against, against the sins that they commit. And so they're going to claim themselves as being dressed in the fashion of advocacy and emancipation, wanting to feel safe and protected in your home, but exploiting anxieties. Yes. How useful is an app? I guess I would like to finish with a question. How useful is an app that tells us how scared we should be in our own homes? And if you kind of are already familiar with the issues that your community faces, what is Neighbors actually doing for you? And what does this mean about the kinds of continuous privatization and individual responsibilities of communities? So that's it.
Next up is Yunyi Li. Yunyi's a PhD student in cinema and media studies at UCLA. Her research focuses on techno-orientalism, labor, transnationalism, and media infrastructures. Okay, can you all hear me okay? Okay. So I'm going to talk about the shared workspace company, WeWork, and the role of the physical workplace within an increasingly digital economy. I didn't realize that we were going to be like next door to a WeWork, so afterwards maybe we can like take a field trip over there. Popular industrial and scholarly writing on digital technology often highlight its capacity to compress time and space,
and thereby foster new forms of communication and sociality. So in terms of work, the proliferation of network information and communication technologies has facilitated, the story kind of goes, the coordination of remote and flexible labor. So this is a disruption of traditional forms of work that is consequently cast as beneficial for workers, employers, and economies alike. WeWork stages itself as a physical space for digital workers, optimizing work through aligning the affordances of the digital with those of the physical, that is, independence with community. Many others, of course, have also pointed to the ways in which these new modes of flexibility and mobility in the digital economy might be better understood as symptoms of precarity rather than entrepreneurial independence, drawing frequent comparisons between the invisible and affective dimensions of digital labor and domestic work. So hopefully I'm going to try to make sense of WeWork's corporate and design strategies and the implications of those strategies as they relate to work and leisure within the context of a networked digital economy. So the digital work world operates with the networked adhocracy as its organizational structure and the project as its basic unit of production. So Clay Spinuzzi writes that unlike more bureaucratic organizations, the adhocracy lacks formal hierarchies and is organized around a specific defined project objective with a specific endpoint. Adhocracies swarm projects, with actors clustering on the project, working on it until it is completed, then dispersing at the end of the project. So adhocracies are sometimes virtual, though these are nevertheless often haunted by the metaphor of physical space. So for instance, Basecamp puts everything you need in one place. Dropbox is a modern workspace. Millions of people have already made Slack the place where their work happens. As Spinuzzi writes, while the always changing, loosely organized nature of organization networks means that adhocracies can rapidly adapt to new contingencies as they communicate, coordinate, and collaborate in temporary configurations, they lack the sorts of serendipitous interactions that help to build trust in more traditional workplaces. Home offices generally don't have water coolers. Since the mid-2000s, physical shared workspace enterprises have kind of saturated the digital sector. Founded by Adam Neumann and Miguel McKelvey in 2010, the shared workspace company WeWork currently possesses a valuation of over $47 billion and houses over 100,000 members, 2,000 employees with around 600 locations operating over 20 countries. Including Australia, Argentina, China, Germany, India, Israel, Japan, Mexico, Peru, and the United States. WeWork's business model at first glance is fairly simple. So the company typically does not own property, but instead rents office space wholesale, partitions these rentals into smaller units, and subleases these units to both individual workers and companies at a profit. Echoing Spinuzzi's analysis of the virtual adhocracy, WeWork markets itself through the notion of serendipitous connection, enabled by the alignment of the best qualities of physical presence and digital labor within a physical social network. So WeWork integrates its local physical and global virtual communities through the purchase of a WeWork membership at a minimum of about $200 a month, depending on the city. And this grants members access to an app-based global network WeWork family. So whether on the app or within a physical WeWork location, WeWork emphasizes community and synergy as beneficial for creativity, self-fulfillment, as well as the bottom line. Founders Adam Neumann and Miguel McKelvey grew up on an Israeli kibbutz and a commune in the Pacific Northwest, respectively. And this countercultural bent kind of grounds the origin story of the company and the WeWork ethos across the company's promotional materials and other industrial texts. So as Neumann recounts, he first noticed upon moving to New York from Israel that the tenants of his apartment building did not greet one another in the elevator. Carrying the kibbutz spirit of being part of something greater than himself with him, Neumann decided to conduct an experiment in which he would try to find a person on each floor to have a coffee with, and after a month, he said that the atmosphere of the building had completely transformed. The logic of WeWork, according to Neumann, interfaces the most valuable aspects of kibbutz sociality with those of capitalist competition. So WeWork facilities are built with a series of choke points, so areas including libraries, kitchens, and hallways scattered throughout. So these choke points function much like the water cooler in a traditional office environment. meant to shape the flow of work and rest and organically drive interaction, serendipitous connection, and synergy so that tenants may find a collaborator, employee, or a mentor. So McKelvey, an architect and the chief creative officer of WeWork, was troubled by the lack of traffic and tenant interaction in a particular open area at WeWork's New York headquarters. After observing how tenants used the space for 8 hours straight, he concluded that the space suffered from a lack of furniture. Playing with the layout of the common space, McKelvey noticed an instant adjustment in the feel of the space after bringing in additional tables and chairs. So networking is thus intentionally built into WeWork's physical design, which seeks to foster not only productive work in the present, but is also oriented towards the potential of future collaboration, cultivating a form of what Miya Tokumitsu calls a labor of hope. So the choke points devised to structure tenant interaction within WeWork co-working locations are, for the most part, these places of leisure. And in this way, leisure is tethered to labor as a form of social reproduction necessary for energizing profitable work, though much of the work is not compensated through conventional means or sometimes at all. Notably, in 2017, WeWork acquired Meetup, a social media company and platform designed to coordinate meetups between like-minded hobbyists. So this emphasis on community and leisure suggests that part of WeWork's appeal is affective, a branding strategy embodied by the doctrines of do what you love and make a life, not just a living, both of which recur across the company's promotional materials as well as within WeWork office locations. So the aspiration of do what you love is further mythologized as part of WeWork's corporate philosophy and history. Per Newman's own account, after moving to New York in the 2000s, he found himself kind of in the state of malaise after two of his startup ventures. So first, women's shoes with collapsible heels and then baby clothes. They both went under. So he was prompted by founding WeWork partner and then girlfriend Rebecca Paltrow-Newman, Gwyneth Paltrow's cousin, to find a job that he was passionate about and that gave him purpose. Because, in her words, success is about passion and doing what you love. After that, she had insisted the money will follow. Following her advice, and despite the downturn of the Great Recession, Newman founded entrepreneurial success with Green Desk, an eco-friendly shared workspace company in 2008, which was then sold to launch WeWork in 2010. Miya Tokumitsu traces the origin of Do What You Love to the class of 2005 Stanford University commencement speech delivered by Steve Jobs. And she argues that the phrase serves as an ideological mechanism that constructs work as a labor of love rather than as part of a system of value extraction. So Tokumitsu colors Do What You Love as a form of class narcissism that dissolves class identification by distinguishing digital and creative labor from other types of low-wage work through an aesthetically salaried form of social capital. So she writes, while exhorting people to perform work that they love, it also denies that this work is work at all. The idealism of Do What You Love thus functions as both a labor of love as well as a labor of hope. And according to Tokumitsu, what hope labor ultimately manifests is a belief in the employment marketplace's justness, faith that assorts workers into appropriate terms of labor. The temporality of hope encourages the most vulnerable workers to double down on the very system that exploits them. There's little impetus to abandon hope of a good life when it appears just within grasp. So to kind of put it simply, the logic of love becomes justification for precarious working conditions in anticipation of assertive romantic fulfillment. Kathy Weeks elaborates on Tokumitsu's argument in her analysis of contemporary workplace self-help literature, much of which increasingly characterizes work through the terms of romantic love. So according to Weeks, the ideologies of love and happiness individualize the work experience because love and romance and happiness are popularly conceived of as private and personal, not public or political. The rhetoric of love and happiness at work also function to depoliticize the employment relation by impeding the formation of collectivities and undermining relations of solidarity. Shannon Mattern describes the digital workplace as an uncanny augmented reality experience in which technology and modernist design are marshaled to enforce empathy and connection with little recognition that those same technology are often used to surveil and alienate and discriminate. Like other platform enterprises such as Uber, the business of WeWork is not only or even primarily real estate that is providing workspace as an on-demand service. WeWork also profits through the extraction of data about the so-called nature of work by observing how tenants use these workspaces, seeking to forge the future of work through this data. In the contemporary work world, the ideal worker is both networked and independent, adaptable and reliable, and able to infect those around them with ambition and ingenuity. Within the WeWork ecosystem and other adhocracies like it, solidarity and political affinity are differentiated from collaboration for corporate and entrepreneurial ends. The formation of communitarian ties through individual empowerment and an individual worker's ability to work well with others are valued insofar as the productive ethics of capitalist competition are reinforced rather than challenged. So I want to quickly end by returning to the notion of a labor of love for a minute. So these analogies made between digital and creative labor and reproductive and affective labor, unpaid or underpaid, often outsourced, and lacking benefits and regular work hours are compelling for good reason, right? So as Trevor Schultz has written, digital work doesn't feel, look, or smell like labor at all. This digital labor is much akin to those less visible, unsung forms of traditional women's labor, such as childcare, housework, and surrogacy. Framed a little differently, however, it's important to also note the ways in which these analogies are somewhat dangerous false equivalencies, as digital labor in turn depends on a human infrastructure of domestic labor, which is then twice obscured. So the upkeep of the clean, sleek WeWork aesthetic is reliant upon large forces of custodial workers who were at the WeWork locations in DC, New York, and Boston, primarily subcontracted through Commercial Building Maintenance Corporation. When WeWork Cleaners in New York City launched a campaign to unionize with Local 32BJ of SEIU in 2015, WeWork President Arthur Minson wrote in an email to WeWork employees, "To be clear, employees always have a right to unionize. However, we don't think having a union at WeWork makes sense. Similar to the way many of you run your businesses, we take great pride in the fact that every WeWork employee is part of the WeWork family." Having an independent voice representing a portion of our employees goes against our fundamental belief that all of the WeWork employees should be treated the same and all jobs at WeWork are equally valued. So this response is a classic union busting tactic made through an affective appeal, reasserting the logic of love and kinship to frame employees as beneficiaries of employer or familial goodwill. In the case of the New York WeWork organizing campaign, the custodial workers in question were paid only $10 an hour, denied benefits such as health insurance, and notably required to wear "Do What You Love" t-shirts as part of their work uniform. They were, in fact, the only WeWork employees required to wear the slogan. So while WeWork had severed its contract with CBM, when CBM workers began to organize, workers continued to fight, winning union representation as well as severance pay for those who were not rehired. So campaigns are since underway to expand union representation, establish collective bargaining agreements at WeWork co-worker locations in other cities. So while WeWork markets itself as a disruptor of traditional forms of work and bureaucracy, the company has also repeatedly engaged in classic kind of analog means of worker repression, right? So subcontracting, union busting, wage theft, misclassification. But as the now union custodial workers at WeWork have demonstrated, these analog forms of organizing are as necessary as ever within this emerging digital work world. Okay, thank you.
Next up is Joshua McWhirter. He's a Brooklyn-based writer, an audio producer, and an editor at Failed Architecture, an online platform for independent architecture criticism.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for being here. I just want to mention again that I'm a writer and editor for, among other things, a digital platform called Failed Architecture. So fittingly, the name of this presentation is Extremely Online Architecture, which is kind of a goofy name. But I also wanted to start by kind of basically name dropping one of the co-founders of this conference, Nathan Jurgensen, who has argued extensively for several years now against the idea of digital dualism in favor of, quote, augmented reality. So the former concept here treats our digital and physical lives as separate, interacting spheres, while the latter phrase, augmented reality, is kind of used here as a metaphor acknowledging the way that digital and physical lives bleed into one another, and how the internet, and in fact most forms of media and technology have always been crucial to the formation of social reality itself. Which is maybe not like a super radical idea to people in this room, but I think it's worth noting that in a field that I particularly have found myself in the last few years, architecture, this is kind of a pretty interesting and sort of out there out there concept. And it's worth noting that digital dualism in architecture is less prevalent when it comes to the ideas of form and form making itself. So the use of software to design buildings has been widespread and acknowledged for many decades now. And algorithmically generated forms as well have been a topic of widespread discussion within the architecture community for at least a decade, thanks to very famous kind of star architects like Zaha Hadid and the sort of advent of parametric design. But when it comes to online culture, like the internet itself, architecture discourse is not all that prepared to handle something like this, basically. I don't know if any of you have seen this meme before, but it is, what we're looking at is an American Chopper meme, the classic American Chopper meme, about the merits of preserving brutalist buildings. The meme kind of dissects the social milieu from which brutalism emerged and within which it eventually, quote unquote, failed. It addresses common misconceptions about brutalism and the actual meaning of the word itself. I mean, basically this meme in 4 parts sums up like at least a decade of sort of many sort of academic debates about the value of brutalism itself as an architectural style. So I'd say that it also speaks to the way in which a once maligned style characterized by, as you see here, kind of bulky geometric forms, unpolished concrete facades, and an embrace of working class futurism has actually become a mainstreamed object of attention thanks to the accelerated circulation of not just architectural images on the internet, but also the acceleration of discourse around architecture and its meaning on the internet. So the effect that internet culture has had on bringing brutalism back, for instance, has been certainly pretty well documented in recent years by writers like Nikhil Saval and others, vis-a-vis its mediation through online platforms like Tumblr or Instagram. So this is kind of like an acknowledgement that brutalism lends itself to Instagram-style scrolling, one eye-popping hunk of brush-hammered weirdness after another. Great phrase. But going beyond how newer visual mediums represent architectural images, we must also consider the circulation of these images through the gears of the attention economy and the augmented realities forged out of something like brutalism's extreme onlineness. So brutalism's online popularity has, of course, impacted its standing in the real physical world. And I would argue that one can draw a direct line from the influence of, say, the Tumblr account Fuck Yeah Brutalism or the Instagram account Socialist Modernism to the recent exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art, the MoMA here in New York, documenting post-war brutalist architecture in Yugoslavia. And even I would say that the increasing interest in brutalism has even begotten actual new brutalist buildings, such as Norra Tornen in Stockholm, seen here, designed by the venerable Dutch firm OMA, famous for its founder, Rem Koolhaas. So what we're seeing here is a kind of pretty perfect distillation of a sort of cultural feedback loop coming full circle. This extremely online ethic born out of a nostalgia for built forms predating the glassy towers of neoliberalism that saturate, for example, New York, creating a stylistic revival within architectural practice itself and eventual market demand for that style. Sadly, though, unlike many old school brutalist projects, this building is actually not a social housing project. Another prominent example of an architectural style being rehabilitated by extremely online culture is postmodernism. And this is a style that's known for its rejection of the clean functionality of modernism in favor of colorful stylistic pastiche, ironic sense of humor, and embrace of kitsch. So basically, I would call this Exhibit B of an extremely online form of architecture because it's flashy, full of references, largely sort of comes from the 80s, and it's vaguely psychedelic, as you can see. It's basically vaporwave as architecture. And nostalgia is a pretty addictive drug that's actually been long denied to the architecture community itself. Like brutalism, postmodern's online visual appeal is compounded by the nature of the social media feed. So rather than being consumed as isolated architectural objects, postmodernism's impact is actually more felt acutely as an ensemble of visual objects. Its weirdness and idiosyncrasies becoming more appealing as you're sort of scrolling through the Instagram feed, for instance. And naturally, the repertoire of Tumblr and Instagram pages focused on postmodern architecture tends to be a bit more promiscuous. It goes beyond the realm of architecture proper to explore the built environment's relationship to art, advertising, and the surreal in a more general sense. Like brutalism, there's also been a revival of postmodern architecture in practice. But interestingly, this revival kind of came about just early enough to be concurrent with the rise of Instagram. So you sort of have this instance where built form and online representation are sort of forming one another in real time. And So you've probably noticed now that there's a theme emerging here in which extremely online architecture becomes a kind of proxy for certain types of worldviews. So for the discipline and profession of architecture itself, I would say this is actually no small wonder. The reinjection of social meaning and politics into the design of the built environment has proved to be a once-in-a-generation shattering of the profession's long-standing and complete assimilation to the demands of a neoliberal economy. Now, the opening up of alternative pasts and futures is having a profound effect on young architectural designers, I believe. Architecture is this famously stodgy and insular profession with high barriers of entry. The combination of a deeply hierarchical professional culture exacerbated by rampant sexism and an extreme lack of diversity, as well as a tendency toward evasive styles of communication, has put the discipline of architecture as a whole at odds with values typically associated with extremely online culture. That is, until architecture itself started to become extremely online. Of course, there's a dark side to this as well, unfortunately, and it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge the fact that architecture has actually been adopted by those who really love hierarchy, sexism, and extreme lack of diversity. And I'm speaking here of the infamous trad arc or traditional architecture Twitter accounts run by extremely online white nationalists who rail against things like the, quote, ugliness of modernist architecture versus the beauty of European Baroqueness, and setting aside all the reasons why this is bullshit and why this argument is fundamentally racist in its praise of colonial aesthetics. I'm also somewhat distressed by how much of the mainstream architecture community at large seems almost unaware or unwilling to confront the significance of something like this. So architecture as a practice and as a public point of interest has been steadily declining in relevance for many decades. In an all too rare instance of the built environment becoming a mainstream talking point, the conversation here is hijacked by white supremacists. Here, the act of being extremely online could be an opportunity to act against the discipline's own reactionary tendencies. And of course, extremely online, and as architecture becomes inseparable from the rest of our extremely online culture, it has also been touched by the internet-led justice movements that have shed much needed light on some of the profession's darkest roots and buried secrets. And extremely online culture has also allowed for a much greater plurality of practitioners in the field to be heard, amplified, and represented, most especially people of color in a culture, professional culture that is still overwhelmingly white. So for instance, about 1 year ago, the Shitty Architecture Men list, modeled after a similar document shared amongst journalists and other media workers, sent shockwaves through the architecture industry, instigating a wave of much-needed conversations, not just about predatory behavior in the discipline, but also the treatment of marginalized groups within architecture as a whole. More recently, the extremely online designer Adam Nathaniel Furman used his popular postmodernist-leaning Instagram and Twitter accounts to condemn the widespread practice of unpaid internships in architecture, which quickly went viral and was even picked up by mainstream news outlets. Aiding Furman in this specific campaign and contributing to the larger effort to politicize architecture is an organization called the Architecture Lobby, which has leveraged online platforms to, among many other things, actually unionize the industry as a whole, which is great. And architecture criticism as well, in the meantime, has become extremely online with the advent of writers like Kate Wagner, aka McMention Hell, who uses the populist and irreverent form of roasting ugly houses as a way to educate people about the intersection of architecture, culture, and class. By the way, this is a McMansion Hell post eviscerating Betsy DeVos's house. Yeah, fucking insane, I know. So with that, I'll just wrap this up quickly. I want to end with a summary thought that might kind of bring together some of these unruly threads and tangents. So if architecture is the heavy physical embodiment of social values, and then society is mediated by digital communication technologies, then I believe it's fair to say that extremely online architecture is helping form the shape of architecture to come in the future. So a profession that desperately needs it, architectural designers could and should more actively engage in this augmented reality of digital culture, even help design this augmentation, so to speak, or at least set the terms of how to harness the energy created by extremely online culture in shifting both the aesthetics and ethics of the 21st century built environment. And that's it for me. Thank you.
So we're just going to start with a little discussion with our panelists and then move on to audience questions. I do want to start the audience question bit with a question from a woman or a non-binary person, so please think of questions so that I can call on you and we can start a discussion that way. But before we begin the audience questions, I just want to thank you to our presenters. Those were really great, interesting points, all of you. And I think that they come back to these conversations that I've been seeing at Theorizing the Web over the past 2 days on a bunch of different panels, and that like everybody is kind of grappling with this question of like, on the one hand, there's this space, there are these kinds of products that we have, that we see, that we interact with all the time, these social platforms, everything that we do online. There's a narrative that like, this is what we think we're doing, and that's what a corporation is telling us. Like Instagram is telling us that we are like having these social relations with our friends. Neighborhood Watch is telling us that we're like increasing safety in our communities. WeWork is trafficking in this language of like doing what we love, also building community. Airbnb is also like trafficking in this domestic, this kind of domestic language. And I think their slogan is like belong anywhere. And one thing that has been coming up is like a bunch of conversations about labor and about how the narratives that these corporations like thrive on, make money off of, obfuscate all of the labor that goes into creating the actual product. So like domestic labor that's going into maintaining the WeWork space as this like pristine kind of thing. Like, oh my God, this water cooler is so beautiful and it's just here, ready to Instagram, like waiting for more people who are participating, who are like buying WeWork memberships to basically like do free advertising for them, even more, like adding on to the advertising that they're already putting out there, sorry. So I just wanted to kind of bring that tension between like this narrative that these companies are putting out there versus like what the space is actually doing, the labor that it's actually obscuring. And Joshua, I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to this. I don't know if my understanding of postmodern architecture is like correct in this way, but it seems to me that there isn't really an obscuring of like the function, right? It's like, fuck you, this is like a building that has no function. We're not trying to like obscure any type of like, this is a picture, it is what it is, if that makes sense. Whereas like these other things that we're talking about, these corporations are like telling you one thing and the thing at hand is actually something else, right? It's like a mechanism for subservience, labor, surveillance, control. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that and if you see like the ways in which people are taking pictures of postmodern architecture, like space, if that's like the same side or the different side of a same coin, how they might relate.
I don't know if I would make the direct connection to postmodernism per se. Well, I guess there's a connection there, which is that postmodernism is all about the visual appeal, right? And I think one of the reasons why it's become so popular on social media is that like it's big, it's flashy, and one of the things that I wanted to, that point that I brought up with bringing up that sort of new brutalist project that was happening in Stockholm was the idea that like kind of all this feeds back into architecture as a sort of system of branding, which I imagine will eventually happen with postmodern architecture. Like it was cool online, and then like designers will pick up on this. Developers will probably realize that it's a sort of a popular aesthetic, and so, I imagine especially in markets like New York, like you'll probably see like new postmodernist buildings pop up because architecture is essentially branding. And I think that concept is, I think, what really ties in with the rest of the talks here, is how design is used to kind of like obfuscate or brand or sort of advertise a thing. I think especially in context of WeWork, particularly, because of course WeWork was founded by an architect. They recently hired Bjarke Ingels, who's a very famous kind of asshole architect man, to be the head designer of like basically these new like I guess neighborhood scale developments that they're planning on building, which is a little disturbing to think about. But I don't know.
Yunyi, do you want to respond to that? Can you just use the mic?
Oh, yeah.
For our live stream friends.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I don't know if I have much of a response, but it is like interesting because earlier we were talking about the fact that WeWork is rebranding into the We Company, which they announced the intentions to do so in January. Haven't done so yet, which I was grateful for because then I would have had to change like every iteration of it in my paper, which I didn't want to do. Right, so, they're developing schools, they're developing, they're developing schools, developing gyms, and I think, you know, part of it is filling a particular niche in which, like, there's the lack of these forms of, I guess what you might call like soft infrastructure, right? And it's also maybe, you can also think of it as a ways in which like work has, because we kind of talked about the way WeWork has acquired Meetup, right, which is kind of for hobbyists, fans, you know, sometimes activists, language learners, things like that, but also just kind of the entrenchment of work and the market into also all of these other spheres as well, yeah.
I was also going to actually, something that I'm thinking about, is this on?
Yes, just bring it to your mouth.
Okay. Something I was actually thinking about with the thread between the architect and maybe some of the other papers on this panel is that if we're thinking about platforms as like virtual or digital homes or buildings or structures that are inhabited, it's kind of like, I guess we could draw a connection to the architecture of these platforms and not just their function, but what they communicate in, you know, the broader kind of social and cultural meaning.
Has anyone thought of a question yet?
Switch this. Oh yeah, cool.
So the WeWork presentation was really interesting to me because online I keep seeing ads for this company called The Wing, and sort of that. And I was wondering if you could talk about, you know, the obfuscation of, you know, like love and labor as it relates to sort of co-working spaces that market themselves with not just sort of an anyone can work here aesthetic, but a very specific aesthetic targeted towards a certain population. It seems to me like they're really trying to market themselves as like a social club that happens to be a service that you pay for in a co-working space. But I was wondering if you could talk about that in the co-working universe.
Yeah, so I don't know a ton about The Wing, but my understanding is it's kind of this, right, as you said, it's like social club, but also co-working space that's oriented towards like women, right? And it's interesting because I think part of like the WeWork ethos is very much about, right, individual empowerment. And in the case of WeWork, it's not really like explicitly gendered, but it is at the same time kind of trafficking these ideas about post-feminism, right? So the idea, you know, lean in all of those things, the idea that, I think there is kind of this thread there that's about, right, so post-feminism is like this idea that, not that it's not like explicitly anti-feminism, but it kind of constructs frames the goals of feminism as having been realized, and therefore feminism is passé. And I think The Wing is trafficking in some of that through the rhetoric of like, you know, it's not about like raising the floor, right? It's not about like collective organizing. It's kind of about individual, right, empowerment through career success, and like networking is always kind of in service as that. So there's the language of like agency and empowerment, but it's kind of channeled through these kind of very neoliberal ideas about advancing the self, I guess. Yeah. I hope that made sense.
So my question is also for you, Yunyi. It was such a good talk. So I guess, on the one hand, right, these spaces like stymie a kind of revolutionary sensibility, right? They like supplement the flexible worker and provide this sort of, you know, I don't know, enjoyment and this sense of like, yeah, self-direction and maybe some sort of companionship. And this is sort of antithetical to desiring like collectivization in some ways, right? Because you're not sufficiently miserable or something, right? Like, or is this?
Yeah.
Because on the other hand, right, then you have this sense that like, well, if we're so fragmented online and we never see each other, there's no conditions from which like the workers on the factory floor see, right? Like, so.
Right.
Is there something about being in a physical space that has that?
Yeah. So I guess, right. So I think, you know, my framing was kind of about like WeWork's branding, right? And that is not to say that like workers are necessarily like duped by it, right? I mean, workers are organizing, right? We see this in journalism. We see this in the video games industry. And so, yeah, so it's not like that these ideologies are like all encompassing. Like, you know, workers aren't like unable to see their class conditions, they often do, right, in spite of the forces of a lot of these ideas, yeah.
I guess this is a thread I've noticed in a lot of these online platforms that are grouping together these services is like the overwhelming positivity. Like anything that critiques us isn't being positive. I actually go to school at a WeWork right now to get into tech, and I feel like there's like policing of negativity that makes you feel like if you don't love everything we're doing, that's a problem. It's unproductive. And then also, like, I guess now we can critique everything online, and that can go into the realm of like white supremacy, or it can be like reclaiming this or that. I don't know. It'd be interesting to hear anyone speak to that.
I think, like in the architecture industry, there's certainly a bit of that. Although it's maybe not so much like a sort of cult of positivity as it is like just like a cult of like this is your calling, and like you're a white collar professional, so therefore like you should feel totally fine with working like at least 80 or 90 hours a week because this is your calling and you're like fortunate enough to do this, and so therefore like don't you dare think about things like unionizing the workforce or critiquing any of the sort of like existing power structures kind of within that. And architecture is like famously, I mean, like it sort of operates almost like as a guild in a way, and it's like very much oriented around mentorship, and a lot of it like, which is like okay, but when the problem with that in that field in particular is that like all the old masters are essentially old white men, and so they tend to like mentor people for whom they sort of see something of themselves in, I guess, which ends up just perpetuating the existing structure. But fortunately, I see a lot of that changing, and a lot of that changing really rapidly and very recently, at least in that industry.
I think also, if I may, what you're talking about is also like context collapse. So when we have social media, when we have all these like ways of interacting with work and with the world, that barrier is a lot harder to produce. Christine, I forget her last name, was talking about this yesterday. She was working for Alexa. She was working for Amazon, specifically on their Alexa, like transcribing Alexa commands, and all of the employees received Alexa, right, like actual Alexas. So if that barrier is a lot harder for you, if part of your work like feels like entertainment, it's a lot easier for a company to say like, well, you're actually having fun, like this is supposed to be fun. I'm going to police you and say like you can't react negatively to this because why would you? It's enhancing your life. Like especially when all of these companies are really talking about like creating space for things as nebulous as community, as nebulous as love. Like it's a lot harder to specifically say like, well, you don't like love? Like,
Yeah, can I actually speak to that real quick? I think with Airbnb, and this is becoming a little bit more prevalent with corporations overall, or sharing economy corporations overall, is that there's this like almost like disarming ineptitude when it comes to handling power. So but it's also a little bit scary because like Airbnb like puts all this money out there and like hires organizers who worked on the like Obama campaign to like organize around city council efforts, and then it loses, and then it posts like these passive aggressive ads all over San Francisco being like, well, I hope you enjoy your tax money. But I think there's also like this kind of like weird way in which that power is, like even in the realm of the political, even in city council, like power is being masked. So when Airbnb, like for example, in Palestine is like renting settled land to like folks, despite the fact that they're like, no, we won't do that anymore, and then they go back on their promise, Airbnb isn't like necessarily talking about the political conditions of that. They're more so just kind of like, well, we're just having difficult dialogues, and we don't want to like we want sensible regulations, and we like it's this kind of like weird way in which these kind of like messages of this isn't political actually make their way into the political sphere itself. I think is what I'm trying to get at.
just want to encourage any folks of color to ask questions because we've just had 3 white people ask questions. So if anybody wants to.
Hi, thanks for all the great talks and organizing together. So, I mean, from all these talks, Airbnb, Ring, WeWork, and architecture, you see kind of a common thread that like these companies are doing branding via what I see as like co-opting kind of leftist terms like love, sharing, community, and so on and so forth. So how do we push back against liberals and neoliberals who are rehabilitating leftism or socialism or communism to instead serve big business and capitalism?
What a great question. I mean, if we knew the answer to that, then of course we would be like doing it. Yeah, sure. So I don't know if I can exactly like answer that in full, but something that I didn't actually get to in my talk was Lindsay Weinberg talks about like the contradictory nature of like privacy discourse and the creation of the liberal subject, and how like using Deleuze and individuation and like the ways that you can actually aggregate data and then like dividuate it in order to control and govern subjects. And so I think like I'm not actually going to claim to know what she says, but I guess, I don't know, collective forms of kind of resisting those, I don't know what that looks like actually at all. And of course, thinking about the fact that Amazon is practically going to own the ground that we walk on in the next couple of years, I don't really know what to make of that.
I think that, so I don't know, I'm like really provocative about this, so I'm going to try to walk it back a little bit so I don't like get myself in trouble.
Do it.
Okay, so the thing that I wanted to say is that I think that like the left really needs to drop rhetorics of community as the thing that's going to save us. Like it's been around for like a long time, and it's done a lot of really important like successful work. But I think that the reason why it's able to be co-opted is because like community, especially through communization and this kind of like end state where we're all not alienated from our labor and just like working with one another. Like I think in WeWork, I think in Airbnb, I think like even with like neighbors, people are able to just say like, well, yeah, but we can achieve that now. Like why like wait till the future when we can actually start building those like structures today and feel at ease in them. And I think that one move that I've seen people do really well in activist work is actually get to the issue at hand, whether it's like racial capitalism, whether it's settler colonialism, like naming that power dynamic and saying that, yes, you have a community, but the community is based on violence. And if we want to like have actually good communities, like we need to destroy yours and rebuild society.
Any other questions? We have 3 minutes left.
I have a question regarding the Airbnb case study. When you, is the burden then on Airbnb or on the cities in which these hosts are providing space? Because the consumer behavior of looking for space and paying somebody to rent out a room is not new and did not come into existence because Airbnb exists. All Airbnb did was reduce friction between the consumer and the host, as well as allow it to occur on scale because of that reduced friction. So, and arguably made it safer because there's added background checks and these things are not happening offline. So, given those precedents, I'm curious, like, is there a world where both city and Airbnb work together, like in the instance of Barcelona, where Barcelona is pretty much guiding Airbnb to enforce its own guidelines and make sure that each property is rented by the host it's saying it's rented from, none of these like pseudo or dummy postings being posted, et cetera. I guess, what does a solution look like? And is Airbnb the only well, I guess corporations are people, person to blame?
Yeah. So to kind of contextualize why I'm using Airbnb is just like a really useful site to think of the issues of governance of home. So like, I think there's like a lot of short-term rental companies that do this. I think there's a lot of cooperative spaces that are kind of like encountering the same issue. And I do think that there's a way to like construct a governance of home that becomes like hegemonic. So like we don't really have single residence occupancy homes as much as we used to, and that's wild because single residency occupancy hotels and like people staying in those rooms were so widespread during the 20s and 30s, and now we're just kind of like, nah, we got apartments. Those aren't really around as much anymore. So I definitely think that there is a way for like Airbnb to collaborate and become like hegemonic. But what I'm more so interested in is in kind of like what are those processes of contestation? Like, what do those look like? What does it mean to negotiate the home in and of itself? And like, in those negotiations, what's going into that? Because like, I don't know, it's kind of like this like, saying another thing that's going to get me in trouble. I think that like tenants' rights groups and housing justice groups are doing really important work in making sure the city is affordable to everyone. But it kind of like is a limited time frame that kind of ignores the larger question of how did the city get to be where it is.
Yeah, I would love to expand on that because in Santa Cruz there's a serious housing crisis going on right now. Housing is just super unaffordable, and there's not very much more of it being built. And so, of course, like with gentrification of Silicon Valley kind of overflowing into Santa Cruz, and the university continuing to accept students but not building more housing, this is creating a problem. Also, it's a very beautiful place, so people want, when they come visit, they want to stay in a gorgeous house right on the cliff and be able to look over at the ocean. And so there's a huge housing crisis, but there's tons of empty houses all over the place. And this is part of like the issues that, I mean, if I look at my neighbor's feed, it's majority homeless people walking up to doors and banging on doors or taking packages or what have you. So I think in city council meetings there was actually like a big fight for rent control that failed in Santa Cruz because there was outside actors kind of brought in, and the National Realtors Association was brought in. And so, of course, like homeowners and not tenants, but landlords, yes. Homeowners and landlords are not concerned with, like your access to housing. They're just like, no, fuck you. Like, we're going to rent out our Airbnb for $200 a night because we can, and why should we have to deal with you and all your foibles as a resident? So, so I think that these issues are definitely connected, and I guess for the city in Santa Cruz in particular to kind of like work against Airbnb, it's like they have to have support of the landlord community, which the landlord community is vehemently against doing pretty much anything to support tenants and to give tenants the right that they deserve. And ultimately, it's a war on working class people.
I think that's a good place to end it. I don't think there are any more panels today, but there's a keynote later tonight at 6. Anybody on the committee can correct me? I don't know, but stick around, meet other people. Thank you again to our panelists. Round of applause. And thank you for sticking with us in this extremely warm room, truly.